Donald Trump walks into Beijing for the first American presidential visit to China in a decade. And he is not walking in to talk about trade tariffs. He is walking in carrying the weight of a naval confrontation that happened 48 hours ago in the Strait of Hormuz, a ceasefire in the Middle East that the American president himself described as being on massive life support, a Taiwan defense budget that just hit $4.8 billion, and an Iranian nuclear file that nobody has been able to close for 2 years. Every single one of those threads lands in the same room on May 14th and 15th, and the outcome of those 2 days will tell you more about where this conflict ends than anything that has happened since February. Let's set the stage, because you need to understand what is already in the room before anyone sits down. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. 20% of the world's entire oil supply moves through that corridor every single day. For the past 4 months, the United States has been running one of the most formidable naval blockades it has assembled since the Cold War. 3 carrier strike groups, more than 200 fifth-generation aircraft, 15,000 naval personnel actively enforcing that blockade. Iran is on the other side of that blockade. Its economy is collapsing, its ceasefire is barely holding, and its command structure is so fractured that regional IRGC commanders can launch drones and fast attack boats without authorization from above. That is the established picture, the one markets and governments have been tracking since Operation Epic Fury began on February 28th. And then, 48 hours ago, China walked into that picture. A Chinese destroyer and 2 support vessels altered course directly toward a United States carrier strike group in the Strait of Hormuz. Not gradually, not ambiguously, they turned toward the American formation at a speed that triggered immediate alerts on U.S. radar systems. For 30 minutes, both sides went to battle stations, fire control systems active, every sensor on every vessel locked onto the other formation. Chinese naval officers speaking in English on open radio channels told the American commander they were conducting their own freedom of navigation exercise, using almost word for word the same language America uses when it describes its own operations. That was not coincidence. That was deliberate provocation wrapped in diplomatic language. China was saying, we can play this game too, in the same language you play it with. And Washington's response shocked Beijing. 30 minutes from the start of that confrontation, a coordinated American diplomatic and military response was already in motion. Regional partners were contacted. Gulf state capitals received substantive calls about base access and intelligence sharing. CENTCOM issued a public statement, direct, unhedged, characterizing Chinese behavior as unprofessional and dangerous before Beijing could establish its own version of events. The United States had wargamed this. They had a playbook. And China's commanders, who modeled hesitation as the likely American response, got the opposite. China did not move warships to the Persian Gulf on a random calendar. Beijing times these moves the way a chess player times a sacrifice, to maximize the message across every audience simultaneously. To Washington, do not walk into the summit room thinking you have the upper hand. To the Gulf states, China is a naval power in this region, and your security calculations need to account for that. To China's domestic audience, Chinese power is being demonstrated in the most consequential waterway on Earth. And to Iran, watching from Tehran, Beijing's presence introduces variables the American military was not designed to manage simultaneously with the Iranian threat. All four of those messages were delivered in 30 minutes, in 21 miles of water. That is extraordinarily efficient strategic communication. And it was timed to land before the summit, so that every decision-maker walking into Beijing on May 14th and 15th would be processing what just happened on the water. Now let's talk about what is actually on the table in Beijing, because the summit is carrying a weight that no single bilateral meeting has carried in recent memory. First, Iran. Treasury Secretary Bessent confirmed Iran will be a centerpiece of the discussion. Iran's Foreign Minister Araghchi visited Beijing in the days before the summit. Beijing told him, in what regional sources described as direct terms, that a deal needs to happen. Araghchi communicated back what he can communicate, that the civilian diplomatic faction understands this, but does not control the IRGC units that would have to stand down. Which brings us to the central question of the summit. Does Beijing have enough leverage over Tehran to actually produce a nuclear concession? Because if Beijing walks in with that leverage and is willing to use it, the entire Hormuz theater changes. The blockade's physics clock, the 3 to 4 month window before Iranian endurance collapses on its own, becomes irrelevant if China can accelerate Iranian capitulation diplomatically. But here's the complication. Beijing may not be walking into that room to give Washington what it wants on Iran. Beijing may be walking in to extract concessions in exchange for it. Taiwan's defense budget passed on May 8th, $4.8 billion. Chip export restrictions are still throttling Chinese technology development. Trade tariff frameworks remain unresolved. China has spent 4 months watching the United States operate in the Gulf with complete operational freedom, and 48 hours ago, it sent a message that era is approaching its expiration date. If Beijing has calculated that facilitating Iranian capitulation serves Chinese interests better than facilitating continued resistance, the game changes. But if Beijing has calculated that any progress on Iran should come at the cost of American concessions on Taiwan, chip restrictions, or trade, then the summit becomes the most complex diplomatic interaction this administration has attempted in a single bilateral engagement. All of it in the same room on the same 2 days. Here's the thing analysts are not saying loudly enough. The Hormuz theater is not the South China Sea. It's not the Taiwan Strait. It is categorically more dangerous than either of those theaters for one specific reason. In the South China Sea, the gray zone competition is U.S. versus China, with regional states as secondary parties. Clean bilateral logic. In the Strait of Hormuz, the U.S.-China gray zone competition is happening simultaneously with an active military confrontation between the U.S. and Iran, with IRGC fast attack boats in the water, with a command structure operating through decentralized autonomous regional units, with a ceasefire on life support, and with unit commanders who can act without authorization from above. That is the specific structural risk that the Hormuz confrontation introduced into an already maximally complex operational environment. And it's the risk that the summit in Beijing has exactly 48 hours to reduce. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide. 3 nuclear powers are now present in or immediately adjacent to that corridor. A ceasefire framework is the only thing holding this from being called a war, and the 2 most powerful nations on Earth are sitting down tomorrow to decide what comes next. China is not going to leave the Hormuz theater. The United States is not going to leave the Hormuz theater, and the 21-mile corridor between them is not getting any wider. Watch what comes out of Beijing on May 14th and 15th. Watch whether China's leverage over Tehran is real or theatrical. Watch whether the price of an Iranian deal is concessions on Taiwan. And watch whether the Chinese naval assets that pushed against an American formation 48 hours ago move again before the summit concludes. Because the warning shot in the strait was not a bullet. But warning shots don't stay warning shots indefinitely when the conditions that produced them continue to intensify. The summit starts tomorrow. We'll be covering every development as it breaks.